Hello and welcome. The topic for today's lecture will be the moral theory known as utilitarianism. This is the first of the really major moral theories that we've seen in this course. Some of the others, such as ethical egoism or the divine command theory, have been problematic in various ways that have had to result in their dismissal largely. They've run into some very, very serious troubles. Utilitarianism, though, is a moral theory that has largely stood the test of time. This is not to say that it doesn't have its issues or it doesn't have its objectors, but in general, it's one of the three very most major perspectives on ethics. And so the first thing that we're going to do then is see what sorts of things make up utilitarianism. Utilitarianism contains three elements. And those elements are first, consequentialism, second, hedonism, and third, the sum totaling and maximization of well-being. Now, of course, I don't expect those things to make sense right away. We'll have to talk about them each in turn to try and explain what each of those things are and how they combine to form the utilitarian moral theory. First, let's talk about consequentialism. Imagine that there's two different buttons that you could push. One of those buttons would give a child a piece of candy, while the second button would give a kitten an electric shock. Now, of course, you might think, who would do such a thing? And that's really just the very point. Because when you think about it, pushing a button is, all by itself, morally neutral. Just the action of pushing your finger down on a button seems to have no moral content whatsoever. Rather, it is what the button does gives the moral content. This is the idea behind consequentialism. But consequentialism takes that idea as far as that idea will go. There are all kinds of specific actions like walking around, waving your fist in the air, or pushing a button that all by themselves are morally neutral. But it matters what they actually do, what impacts they have on the world that gives them their moral character. And so the idea behind consequentialism is that not only consequences matter to morality, but consequentialism says that consequences are all that matters. And this is one of the elements that utilitarianism takes very seriously. They take seriously the idea that the only thing that makes something right or wrong is what it actually causes in the world. The second component of utilitarianism is a view known as hedonism, and it picks up where consequentialism leaves off. It's obvious that good consequences are good and that bad consequences are bad, but the question is that what makes some consequences good and others bad? That is, what does the word good and bad relevantly mean? And that's what hedonism seeks to answer. First, we have to talk about two different ways for something to be good, and then we can talk about how hedonism interacts with consequentialism in utilitarian theory. There are two ways for something to be a good thing. One kind of a good thing is what we call an extrinsic good. And these are things that are good for the sake of something else. That is, they're instrumentally good. The other way of something being good is it being an intrinsic good. This is good in and of itself, or something that is good for its own sake. Many students will misunderstand these words and believe that extrinsic means external and that intrinsic means internal, such that internal goods are things that are good for you and external goods are things that are good for other people. This is not correct. If that were correct, we would say external and internal goods, but we do not. Let's look at some examples. The division between these two things clearer. First off, in extrinsic goods. Best example of an extrinsic good is money. In fact, king of all extrinsic goods. Think of it this way. If you had some money in your pocket, which you may well, are you going to keep it forever? Treasure it and never let it go? Of course not. You're going to turn it into something else that you value more, possibly as soon as you can. If money was valuable in and of itself, we would never give it up in exchange for other things. The fact that we give up money for something that we actually value more makes money extrinsically good. It's good for the sake of what we can get with it. This is the mistake that misers make. They assume that money is good in and of itself, and so they never spend any of it, even on things that they actually need. Exercise is one of those things where all by itself it isn't valuable, but it's valuable insofar as it can make you feel better or can make you healthier. All by itself, it doesn't seem to be really worth anything. And of course, education has, in some sense, an extrinsic value. After all, one of the reasons you're taking this class is probably so that you can make progress toward a degree. And the reason you would want to make progress toward a degree would be in order to get a better job. And the reason you want a better job is to get money. And the reason you want money is to really get something else that makes you happier. So all of those things are, to an extent, extrinsic goods. They're good for the sake of something else. They're something that's good on your way to something that you feel like is better. Now, of course, that's not the only value of education, but it is a part of education's value. By contrast, let's look at some examples of intrinsic goods. One of these is, of course, education. You'll notice it on the list. And it may be, and it depends on who you ask, but there's a certain value in education that isn't something that will make you more money or will make you happier or will make your life go better for you, but it is still better to know some things than to not know them. It's better to be wiser than to be unwise, even if it never makes you any money or makes your life go any better for you. This is the intrinsic value of education, right? It's part of something that's valuable in and of itself. In fact, education does have both of these values. It has both an extrinsic component and an intrinsic component. And very often people who talk about education policy will be disagreeing, one of whom thinks education is intrinsically valuable only, and the other who thinks it is extrinsically valuable only. Such people will end up talking past each other. Things like personal virtue, simply being a good person, may have kind of intrinsic value. And finally, let's talk about pleasure as an intrinsic value. This is really where hedonism will come into our discussion. Hedonism, as we'll see in a moment, is the view that pleasure is really the only intrinsic good. And it doesn't take a lot to demonstrate that pleasure is an intrinsic good. It seems to be good for its own sake. For example, if I ask, why are you taking this class? You might say, well, to get a degree. And why would you want a degree? Well, to get a good job. Why would you want a good job? Well, to have some, lots of money. And why would you want lots of money? Well, so I can buy the things I want. Well, why would you want to buy the things you want? Well, because they bring me pleasure. And if I ask them, why would you want pleasure? Now my question really doesn't make sense. It seems like we don't have a good answer for that one. Why would we want pleasure? At some point, you just have to say, well, look, have you tried it? It seems that we bottom out when we start talking about pleasure in a very basic way. That indicates that pleasure is probably an intrinsic good. And so hedonism, as we've said before, is the view that pleasure, Schaefer-Landau uses the term happiness instead of pleasure, is the only intrinsic good. And of course, by contrast, this means that pain is the only intrinsic evil. And so when we take hedonism, this view that pleasure is really the only intrinsic good, and consequentialism, the view that what makes an action right or wrong is what it actually does, we get the view that what makes an action right or wrong is what kind of pleasure it causes and what kind of pain it avoids. Those are the consequences specifically that utilitarians will pay attention to. It's pleasures and pains. And that is what ends up getting sum totaled. That means added all together, and maximized. That means we take the total, the one action that has the greatest overall balance of pleasure over pain, and you choose the one that has that greatest number. The word that Schaefer-Landau uses in the text is called optimific, a really excellent word you can use at lunch to impress your friends. And so the idea then behind utilitarianism, if you're going to be a utilitarian, is to do this. You anticipate the consequences of all of the actions that are available to you at any given time. and you total up the amount of pleasure or pain that those actions would cause overall, and you get a kind of score, in a sense, for each action. But of course, you might ask, how do we total up all of the pleasures and pains of the options that are available to us? It's at this point that we can bring in something very interesting from the history of philosophy, and that is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is, in many ways, the godfather intellectually of utilitarian theory. He's really the first person who reasonably recently, in what philosophy called the modern period, the period between 15 and 1800, really defended utilitarianism in a very concrete way. He was one of the great popularizers of the theory. He was a British citizen who lived from 1748 to 1832. And whenever I do a lecture on Jeremy Bentham or any of his ideas, I tend to show the class a photo just like this one and say, look, how does a guy who died in 1832 have a color photograph taken of him? A real, actual color photograph taken of him. And of course, nobody actually gets the correct answer. This here is a photo. This was taken in 2012. And the correct answer is that it really is actually him. You see, as part of his will, at his own request, he was, after his death, publicly dissected for a demonstration, and then had this thing, it's called an auto icon, created. And they created it by padding his skeleton with hay and then dressing it with his clothes. He had a friend of his, again at his request, mummify his head. Now, of course, this mummified head looks like a mummified head. It does not look particularly lifelike. If you're curious what it looks like, you can certainly Google the image. But because it really didn't look particularly convincing, they had a wax head made that used some of Bentham's actual hair to be put in this box. Now, a lot of people sometimes make very strange requests for what's to be done with them after they die. And I think it's really a mark of how much people really respected Bentham that he made this completely crazy request and that they did it, and that he's still in a box at University College in London. For a while, he was wheeled out to all regular Royal Society and University College meetings. But lately it's only at important anniversaries like the 100th or, for example, 150th anniversary of his death. His most recent participation in one of these meetings, he was rolled out in 2013 at one of the University College of London meetings, and he was listed as present but not voting. His mummified head, by the way, used to be displayed with the rest of his body in the box, but became such a common target for various kinds of student pranks that it was then securely locked away later. And so here's how Bentham's hedonistic calculus works. If you're thinking of calculus as a kind of math problem, you're actually quite near to the truth. The way that it works is this. For every option that's available to you, you should total up all of the prospective or possible pleasures and pains as follows. You need to first consider the intensity of each pleasure as a positive number and pain as a negative number. And of course, intensity we understand, right? When you go into a hospital or to a doctor's office, they'll often give you the pain chart. They'll try and have you rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is a very mild pain and 10 is a very, very severe one. And actually, most people rate most things comparably to each other, which is why this works at all as a diagnostic tool. And so you could do something similar with the intensity of pleasures and pains, giving pleasures positive numbers and pains negative numbers. And of course, more intense equals the higher number. You can multiply that intensity by the duration of each pleasure, that is, how long it lasts. A pleasure that lasts longer is going to be better than a pleasure that lasts, well, less long, while a pain that lasts longer is going to be worse than one of shorter duration. Thirdly, the certainty of each pleasure or pain should be taken into account. A more likely pain or pleasure is going to be more important to pay attention to than a less likely pain or pleasure. Of course, not all consequences are equally likely. Some are much more certain than others to happen, and so that, of course, needs to be taken into account. Things that might be very serious but have a very small risk might still be weighed very heavily, whereas things that have a very high probability, but even a very sort of low intensity, can still be considered to be important. And finally, here's another word you can use at lunch to impress your friends: the propinquity of each pleasure or pain. Propinquity is really the only word in English that means that's the only single word anyway. It means nearness in time. So the propinquity, it refers to how soon something will happen. And so, true to the saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, propinquity means that a pleasure that is going to happen sooner rather than later is, all things being equal, going to be more valuable. Although, of course, something that is very valuable but is going to take a long time to arrive, might be as valuable or more valuable than something that's only a little pleasurable, but that'll happen immediately. Another word that you can use to impress your friends is the word fecundity. It almost sounds like a filthy word, but it isn't. It's the only word in English that means this. It means the propensity of something, or the tendency of something, to produce more things like itself. Right? So dandelions, for example, are very fecund. One dandelion has the ability to produce many more dandelions, many things like itself. And so a fecund pleasure is one that can produce more pleasure like itself. So the intellectual pleasures are this way. Once you develop a certain talent or develop a certain taste, you can gain more and more and more pleasure from indulging that taste, or from from some refinement of that taste. Um, whereas some pains might be similar. So, for example, the pain of a bad addiction that could simply get worse and worse and worse and feed on itself. Right? That's a very fecund pain. And so the idea is that some kinds of pleasures or pains bring along more like themselves, and if and that's going to matter for the overall consequences. Next, we have to consider the purity of the pleasure and pain, because many actions don't purely produce pleasures or purely produce pains, but will do some mix of the two. So something that is more purely pleasurable is going to be better than something that will produce pleasure and pain in equal measure. Likewise, something that is just purely painful will be worse than something that comes with at least some pleasures. And finally, you have to do this for everybody, for each person who is affected by each prospective action you might do. That is the extent of the pleasure or pain. So this is one of the things when people make very hasty utilitarian arguments, they really forget how much detail you should really have to go into if you're going to very thoroughly make a decision in the utilitarian way. You really do have to make a very good faith effort to anticipate what kinds of consequences you're talking about, what kinds of pleasures, how intense they are, how long they last, how probable each is, how near they are in time, what whether they'll be fecund pleasures or not, whether they're pure, and how many people will be affected. All of these things are quite involved, uh, and so it's no easy task. And of course, you'd only do this full rigmarole with a very important decision, and most others can largely go without. Now, we want to cover some common misunderstandings of utilitarianism as it's often portrayed. And the first one of those is that people will often say this. They will say, utilitarianism says to do whatever benefits the majority. And so you'll get a lot of sort of cockamamie examples like, look, if 51 people really don't like 49 people, they can just kill them. And that's what utilitarian says is the right thing to do. This is not really the case. It's untrue. It may be better to choose a very large benefit to a minority over a very small benefit to a minority. And if we're looking at the 51 versus 49 story, notice utilitarianism is going to say that you're supposed to choose the one action that produces the best overall consequences. So no matter how much the 51 might like to kill the 49, it's going to produce better overall consequences to do something like, oh, maybe not kill them. Also, oftentimes, utilitarianism is misstated as saying that we must choose whatever creates the greatest happiness. And this is not exactly right, it's closer. But rather, something that generated really great happiness and great misery would be worse than something that produced just a little happiness and no misery. That's where the purity of something comes in. So now we're going to present some criticisms of utilitarianism and some of the utilitarian responses to such criticism. And I want to make it really clear that as we sort of go on and sort of present some of these criticisms of utilitarianism, I don't want you to get the sense that utilitarianism gets all these criticisms because it's a bad theory. In general, it gets criticisms of this kind because it's a good theory, because it's actually worth our time getting to know it better. And so some of these criticisms can very often help us to understand the theory a little better. And again, we don't want to spend our time criticizing things that are obviously stupid. We want to spend our time criticizing things that really have a great deal of plausibility. Utilitarianism is definitely one of those things. So let's take a look at that first criticism. It says this, right? If the morality of our actions depend on their consequences, then we won't know whether something is moral or not until all of the consequences play out. Right? This might give a person worry because they might say that what any theory of morality ought to give us is moral knowledge of some kind. It should tell us right when we act, or even before we act, what the right thing to do is or would be. And it seems that utilitarianism, since it relies on the consequences, relies on something that happens after the action, it seems like the person doing the action would not be able to know the moral status of their action before doing it. And the utilitarian will respond generally by saying, yes, this is actually true. But it isn't actually a reason to believe that morality does not depend on the consequences. And it's no reason not to try to bring about the best overall consequences. So this might be something that strikes you as a little bit strange about utilitarianism, but it doesn't actually devalue the theory in any way. Another criticism is, look, if I do something reasonable and it turns out badly, then I will have done the wrong thing, according to utilitarianism, and therefore should have done something unreasonable, again, according to utilitarianism. And so then the objection is that utilitarianism can require me to be unreasonable at times. So let me give an example of how this might work. Say, for example, a doctor has an option of two different treatments. One of them works really well for most people, but not well at all for this very small number of people. Some, let's say, 1% of people. And treatment B doesn't really do hardly anything for most people, but for that 1% that treatment A doesn't work very well for, it completely cures them. And so say the doctor does the reasonable thing when they get a patient with a certain condition, they're going to try the treatment that really works for most people, instead of the one that works for only the tiny minority of folks. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. But if it just so happens that the person they treated was in that minority, well, then the doctor would have done the morally wrong action. And so you say, should we then have required the doctor to do the irrational thing, to give this person something that was very unlikely to help them? Well, this is what the utilitarian responds. The utilitarian says that such an objection is going to mix up whether an action is the right action and whether that action is praiseworthy. It seems like those are two different things. If it didn't accomplish the best outcome, it really wasn't the right action. And I think we really can say that. The doctor's action did not, in fact, make the world a better place. But since we get better consequences when we praise reasonable actions as opposed to unreasonable ones, we should praise the doctor for doing as they did, while saying that it turned out that it was the wrong action. And that does make a degree of sense. So there are several things that people generally like very much about utilitarianism, some features that the theory has. Right? These are things that people tend to like about it. The first of those is utilitarianism's impartiality. What we mean by that is that in utilitarianism, everybody's pains and pleasures are counted equally. Everybody counts as one. Nobody's pains or pleasures are any more important than anybody else's. Utilitarianism is impartial to a very extreme degree. This seems right in a moral theory. Second, flexibility. Utilitarians don't say that a certain type of action, for example, lying, is either always wrong or always right. It's going to depend on what actually happens once that action is taken. Not all lies, for example, may be morally wrong. Only those that tend to, or that in fact have bad consequences. Now, because most lies do tend to have bad consequences in the long run, many of them will in fact not be the right thing to do. But there can be examples where a lie might actually lead to the best overall consequences, might contribute to making the world actually better for people, and at least under those kinds of circumstances, the utilitarian could say that in that specific case it was okay. This is a kind of flexibility that people often like very much about utilitarianism. Also, utilitarianism is a very demanding moral theory in several senses that we'll talk about later. Utilitarianism makes a ruling on each and every action, no matter how small. And this is because every action has consequences. And so, it's one of a number of possible actions that could have been taken. And so this is another thing to like about the moral theory, is that it has the ability to tell you about literally any action that you might ever take, instead of having some things where it just is silent about, or things that doesn't say anything about one kind of action or another. Utilitarianism will say something about every action that has any consequences at all. And finally, another thing people often like about utilitarianism is that it includes a kind of plausible moral community. And it sort of helps to explain in a very reasonable way why some things are morally relevant or sort of part of the moral community and other things are not. And the answer that utilitarianism gives to this is that anything that can feel pleasure or pain should be considered as part of the moral community. Now, this includes animals, children, adults with severe mental handicaps, and other moral theories may rely on certain sorts of abilities of rationality. But a lot of people think this is too restrictive, and utilitarianism can explain why they're a little bit more inclusive. Of course, tables and chairs, not part of the moral community because they can't feel pleasure or pain. But animals and very small children, even though their rational capabilities are less than those of ordinary adults, they do still feel pleasure and pain, and so have to be considered from the moral perspective, according to utilitarianism. And again, this seems right. So now that some of the smaller objections and clarifications are out of the way, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that people really object to utilitarianism, some of the difficulties that the theory really does face. Because we're going to find out that even our best moral theories, and utilitarianism really is one of our best moral theories, are not perfect. They do have difficulties. The first of these is a famous one, and it's a very old one. In fact, utilitarianism was a position that was not unknown to the ancient Greeks. And no less than people like, for example, Aristotle dismissed utilitarianism largely as a result of this objection, the philosophy of swine objection. And the philosophy of swine objection goes like this. It says that the life of pleasure is the life of a pig in slop, and that's not a fit life for a human being. This is, you'll notice, an objection to the hedonism part of utilitarianism, the part that says that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. And the picture of life that people get when they hear this is one that doesn't sound very flattering. It seems like just a life of sort of wallowing around in the mud or lounging around on the sofa eating Doritos or something like that. And that doesn't really seem like the very pinnacle of human life. And so if that's what utilitarianism is telling us is the pinnacle of human life, well, then there would be something wrong with utilitarianism. The most famous response to this objection, the philosophy of swine objection, is a fellow by the name of John Stuart Mill. He's another British citizen, lived from 1804 until 1873. He was the son of the noted author James Mill, who was a very close friend of Jeremy Bentham. You'll notice Bentham, he was the one who was stuffed and put in a box, who was a very popular utilitarian writer. He was, in some sense, the sort of the godfather of modern utilitarianism. Now, what's very interesting is that a lot of the objections to utilitarianism that people bring up are things where Bentham and others would say, look, the only reason you think that this is an objection to utilitarianism is because people weren't actually raised to think like utilitarians. Things that might seem funny would actually make perfect sense if you were raised to them, and they are perfectly rational, each, all on their own. And so, of course, then James Mill has a son, young John Stuart Mill, and it's experiment time. And so they, for the most part, isolated him from most other children so that they could raise him as this perfect genius utilitarian. He was pushed very hard. He was a very bright child. And he was, he was expected to have a long and effective, brilliant scholarly career. And it worked perfectly. He ended up writing a book called Utilitarianism, which is one of the best defenses of utilitarianism that's ever been written. And he did have a long and very brilliant academic career. John Stuart Mill's reply to the philosophy of swine objection starts with the following fork. He says this. He says, if it's true that the pleasures that satisfy a pig are the same ones that satisfy a human, well, then utilitarianism is simply true, even if we are offended by it. However, if it doesn't seem true that the pleasures that would satisfy a pig are the very same as the pleasures that would satisfy a human, then this is no longer an objection to utilitarianism. Again, as long as the utilitarian can account for the difference between the kinds of pleasures that would satisfy a human, or that would be fit for a human, and those that would be fit for a pig in slop. Mill, in fact, does that. He makes a distinction between higher quality pleasures. These are more refined and more fit for a human well-being, and then these lower quality pleasures that are sort of more basic and animal, again, the kind of pleasures of a pig in slop. And he says this. He points out that nobody would become an animal voluntarily, even if they were assured that they were to get the full quantity of animal pleasures. As good a life as my cat has, I really wouldn't trade places with him. Also, Mill says that no intelligent person would consent to become a fool, even if they could be assured that fools have more fun. And no educated person would give up their learning, even if they were sure that ignoramuses are more satisfied with their lives. The famous quote is, "It is better Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." The reason he comes up with the difference between all these things is that all of these more elevated pleasures, these more human pleasures, the more intellectual pleasures, they are of higher quality than the basic pleasures. And so really this is why I think Schaefer-Landau uses the term happiness rather than pleasure. Because when you use pleasure, it makes people think only of the animal or the basic pleasures, and not of all of the more refined and elevated pleasures that are necessary to a full quality life for a human being. And so the utilitarian sort of skates out of the philosophy of swine objection by saying that really, once you consider the kinds of pleasures that really are good enough for human beings, well, then you have a plausible story indeed, right? And you want to have a moral theory that creates more of those things and generally less pain. A second argument we can take a look at is what's called the measurement argument. And it goes like this. The first premise is that utilitarianism is only true if there is a precise unit of measurement that can determine the value of an action's results. Premise 2 says there is no such unit of measurement. Therefore, the conclusion, utilitarianism is false. Of course, the argument is valid as written. Again, review the definition of validity from the first week if you don't quite see. And so if the conclusion is untrue, and any utilitarian is going to want to resist the conclusion that utilitarianism is false, if they're going to do that, then they have to disagree with one of the two premises. One of those two must, in fact, be. Well, of course, the second premise is true. We don't, in fact, have a standard unit for how much pleasure somebody's experiencing at any particular time. If we did, we could call them perhaps hedons, right? Hedons of pleasure. And I've long thought that one great benefit to a utilitarian would be something like a little scanner, like it looked like a ray gun or something. You could point at somebody, and it would tell you exactly how much pleasure they're experiencing at any particular time. It might be, say, 3 hedons or 4 hedons of pleasure or something like that. We have no such unit, so of course that second premise is true. But that first premise, as tempting as it looks, it really falsely assumes that quantification or comparison requires numerical measurement, and it does not. After all, you can say that one person is taller than another, even if you never measure each of them. You can just see them compared with one another. There's all kinds of things that you can compare. One thing can obviously taste better than another, even if you can't have a unit of measurement for how good things taste. Right? So the premise is really kind of ridiculous. Another of the difficulties that you'll see that utilitarianism has might look a little bit funny. Because if you've been paying very close attention, you'll notice that the demandingness of utilitarianism is something that the people who liked utilitarianism liked about utilitarianism. And it just goes to show you something interesting that you'll see with a variety of other moral theories as well, that sometimes the very feature that people point to as sort of a really good point about the theory, from another perspective might actually reveal a trouble with that particular feature. So the old saying is that one person's feature is another person's bug. And so, according to one perspective on demandingness, it's a feature of utilitarianism. According to another perspective, it's a bug. And so the bug perspective goes something like this. Certainly, utilitarianism is demanding. The question is it too demanding? And one particular way in which it might be too demanding is motivationally. It may be that utilitarianism is motivationally too demanding because it would have us think about nothing but the greatest general good all the time. That is, in the reasons for our action, it would always demand of us that we look at things from the utilitarian perspective, when really we might have lots of other kinds of perspectives, or lots of other kinds of things that we would want to consider in various circumstances. And the reply to this is rather unique. It's one of the, I think, one of the strangest things about utilitarianism that's nevertheless true. There are many utilitarians who say that the theory itself, utilitarianism, is best considered as a standard of rightness. That is, you can use utilitarianism to decide what sorts of things are right and wrong, but you don't really use it as a decision procedure. That is, you don't think like a utilitarian when deciding what actually to do. And so their claim is that it might produce better consequences not to think about only the consequences all the time than it would to be sort of to go overboard anticipating unknown consequences. And so the claim then is that perhaps the best way to be a utilitarian is to not explicitly think like a utilitarian. And this, if this seems too odd for you, then you see part of the trouble with the demandingness objection. Uh, but strictly speaking, it doesn't actually invalidate the theory. Utilitarianism may still be the best moral theory. And if your reason for not being a utilitarian is, in fact, to create the greatest general good, then you are actually being a utilitarian. And so this is, again, one of the more interestingly subtle kinds of answers to objections you do sometimes get with utilitarian philosophers. And so what you want to do is you'll want to see Bernard Williams's article that is linked in the online readings for this course for some cases that seem to indicate the motivational shallowness of utilitarianism. In those kinds of cases, you'll see that a couple of characters are being asked to make decisions on the basis of overall consequences, and it'll have to ignore things like, for example, personal moral commitments or projects of various kinds that seem to be part of a quality human life. Another way in which utilitarianism might be too demanding is that it's too demanding on our actions, because it would require us to always do that which had the best consequences. So one example of how this might work is if you think of eating breakfast in the morning. Of course, you might, wake up, make yourself a Pop-Tart or something like that. But could you have woken up somewhat earlier and made breakfast for all of the people that you happen to live with? Surely you could have, and if that would have created more happiness than you just eating a Pop-Tart, then it seems like you were obligated to do that. And honestly, you might also have been able to make breakfast for several random strangers as well. And if that would have created more happiness than simply making breakfast for the people that you live with, then you really would have been required to do that. Because remember, you're required to do the one thing available to you which creates the greatest possible pleasure over pain. And so the reply that utilitarians often give to this is that they simply accept this. They say, yes, utilitarianism is very demanding of our actions. It does really require that we do the best possible action all the time. And while that might not be practically feasible, like people might not really be able actually to do that all the time, still, don't we want a moral ideal, even if that ideal is practically out of our reach? After all, we do still bother with laws, even though we know there will always be lawbreakers. For an expression of just how demanding utilitarianism can be, I want you to look at Peter Singer's argument concerning world poverty. That's also one of the extra readings in this unit. Peter Singer is a modern, very classical utilitarian. He's going to give us a very utilitarian argument about what to do about world poverty. And as you can see, it's quite demanding. It's really quite a lot more than people in fact do. And again, another way in which utilitarianism might be too demanding is this, right? That utilitarianism makes the optimistic action the only morally acceptable action all the time. And so what that means is there would be no room for what are called supererogatory actions. This unit is full of words you can use at lunch to impress your friends, and supererogation or supererogatory is one of those. A supererogatory action is an action that is good, but goes beyond what is morally required. So think, for example, giving somebody a kidney. Certainly, it's very nice of you to do that, but I think it would be hard in any ordinary circumstance to say that you are simply obligated to give somebody one of your kidneys. And again, the utilitarian's just going to bite the bullet on this one. They say, yes, it's true that utilitarianism says that there are no supererogatory actions. There are no actions that go above and beyond moral duty. But again, don't we want a moral ideal even if that ideal is practically out of reach? Next, you'll notice that one of the other things that utilitarians really like about utilitarianism also brings about an objection. People very much like that utilitarianism is impartial, but is it too impartial? For the flavor of this objection, I want you to imagine a circumstance. Imagine two people are drowning at sea, and your boat can only get to one of them before they drown. Say one of them is to your east and one of them is to your west, and they're far enough away that you have to certainly pick one of them to go toward. And of course, you're equally close to both of them. Just imagine now that one of those people is your spouse, and the other of them is a stranger. Most people, notice, find this to be a very, very easy decision. Of course you go immediately after your spouse instead of a stranger. But again, think like a utilitarian. For a utilitarian, this is not at all an easy decision. If you're equally between them, they're both human beings, and you say, well, certainly I'm going to miss my spouse very much. It would be terrible to lose them. But of course, you have to think it's just as likely that the other person has a spouse that will miss them just as much, will be just as sad at their demise. Of course, I know you probably believe that your spouse is a very high-quality person, one who will bring many more great things in the world if they but live. Well, so may this stranger. In fact, the stranger may even be far superior. Or might be far worse, might bring many evil things to bear on this earth, and you just don't really know. And so you have really no basis for trying to prefer one over the other. And so maybe utilitarianism, as something of a very last tiebreaker, might say, okay, fine, it's your spouse, go ahead and get them. But imagine how your spouse would actually feel about this. You go and you pick them up and you save them and say, oh, thank you for saving me. And instead of saying, well, of course, what else would I do? You say, you know, it was the very last tiebreaker. This is what Bernard Williams calls, who's actually the person who came up with this example, he calls this having one thought too many. This is a criticism of the kind of motivation it seems like you'd have to have if you were really going to be a utilitarian. Williams and others think that utilitarianism is unrealistic or even undesirably impartial. But of course, the utilitarian will say this. They will say, look, despite the strangeness of this kind of example, in some cases, everybody who really thought like a utilitarian would really find nothing strange about this. right? It seems, again, if you really want to consider the merits of the theory, and it does have its merits, that it's going to come with some things that will seem strange if you don't think like a utilitarian or weren't raised to think that way. Additionally, it's the flexibility of utilitarianism that will also get it into trouble. You'll notice that each of these features, each of the things that people really liked about it, will also bring up something that people really don't like about it. And of course, utilitarianism is very flexible. But the objection might be that it is too flexible. And there are a couple of different flavors of this one. First off, you can imagine some exotic situation arising in which killing somebody might lead to the best overall consequences of any available action. And if that were the case, then it would be the right thing to do. Not just allowed. It wouldn't just allow you to kill somebody to create the best overall consequences. No, utilitarianism would in fact require that you killed somebody under those circumstances. And that seems to a lot of people absurd. It seems like morality, if it's anything, should have at least some lines that you simply don't cross. And utilitarianism does not provide any of those. And it's this flexibility that's responsible for that. Now, of course, the utilitarian, again, will bite the bullet and say, well, look, that only sounds absurd if you think that there is something more to morality than the consequences. For an illustration of this kind of flexibility and the trouble that it might bring, I want you to see yet another one of our other readings from the course. This one is linked in the other readings. It is a sort of short story by a writer named Ursula K. Le Guin called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which is a very thought-provoking sketch of a kind of utilitarian world and some of the consequences that may be involved in there. So it's a very excellent analysis that provokes a lot of thought. So take a look. Another way that utilitarianism might be too flexible is this, right? It really isn't hard to imagine some situations in which punishing the innocent could have the best overall consequences. So, for example, if everybody thought an innocent person was guilty, it may restore or maintain faith in law and order in general, which might have very good overall consequences. Executing or punishing publicly some innocent person for something or other might do a lot to keep everybody in line and might contribute to social order, as long as it were never discovered. And if it were never discovered, it might be the best overall consequences. Again, it's not hard to think of some plausible circumstances under which this might be true. And for some examples of just exactly this kind of thing, see J.J.C. Smart's Utilitarianism and Justice reading, also linked in the online readings for the course. And now, if that was the case, where we could imagine the best overall action conflicting with our ideas of justice, that would make utilitarianism unjust, which would be a very big problem for utilitarianism. So, to sum up some of the major ideas you'll want to remember and keep track of in your mind from utilitarianism, remember the three major elements of utilitarianism, the ideas that make up this very interesting moral theory. Those elements of consequentialism, the idea that consequences are all that matters to morality, the idea of hedonism, the idea that those are the consequences that a utilitarian is going to look for. That is, consequences of pleasures or pains, because pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain is the only intrinsic evil. And this idea that what we're supposed to do is total up all of the possible pleasures and pains that might be caused by each of our available options and choose the one that maximizes or that is optimific of human well-being. And also notice, I want you to remember some of the things that make utilitarianism appealing to people, as well as generate some of its objections. For example, its demandingness, how much it really does ask of us, and specifically what it asks of us. Its impartiality, right? And also its flexibility.